Okay, I think hopefully everybody can hear me, and I think it's I have 3 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started with today's class session, and we're in week right now, and I posted on for the on the course module in Brightspace that we're going to be covering probably toward the end of this class session some of the work of Marx and Engels, which was now in the syllabus, and I mentioned last time that it's as I was preparing the syllabus. And we're sort of in the process of redesigning this course. For whatever reason, I had omitted it, and but I deliberately built in some flexibility to the schedule, particularly given toward the very end, given the fact that if we needed to or wanted to take the opportunity to talk about some current events or some other issues which were some of interest, that we could do that. So we're going to talk a bit about Marx, but before we do that, we're going to finish up what we've been started last week. We were talking about some of the early economic thinking, and just to sort of recast where we are and what the logic of this is, up until really last week, we were sort of laying the groundwork and doing what was mostly introductory content, terminology, things like supply and demand, some pretty basic modeling like the production possibilities model, the circular flow model, and we actually did a supply and demand model, just so that we have some of the basis so that we know from when we refer to demand or we refer to supply, what it is we're talking about as we go forward. But then really the core of this class is to talk about how we got where we are. I think that one of the times, sometimes I think people are confused about economics, and we know this. We know that a lot of people struggle with thinking about economics, with understanding what's going on, and even our news media does it. There's not a day that goes by that I don't watch the news and someone talks about inflation and how it's President Biden's problem. And those of us in the know that President Biden has really nothing to do with inflation. And we're going to talk much more about that. And this sounds completely wrong. And you would think that, well, this economist here is telling me something that's not right because I hear it every day on the news. Well, it's not right. And it's not right because it's a monetary phenomenon, and the president doesn't have any control over money. And we're going to talk much more as we sort of circle back to talk more about the Federal Reserve and monetary policy and fighting inflation a bit later in the course. But we want to sort of, I think it's important to know how we got to where we are and where we were at one point in the not too distant past. And so we're going back to the 18th century. I know that some people who have taught this course want to go all the way back to the Middle Ages or the medieval period, talk about feudalism and all that. And certainly does in the works that he gets into, and we'll talk a bit more about him later. I don't know that that's particularly productive because I think economics itself has changed radically since the advent of the Industrial Revolution, and I think it's important to sort of pick up the major themes that were talked about from there. Okay, so I posted a couple of links to Marx that deal with some of his work dealing with surplus value, the surplus theory, labor value. And you can have a look at those. Engels, it was interesting, and I wanted to talk about him a bit later. And if I don't get to him today, I'll certainly cover it next week, where he talked about the origins of the family and private property, which I think is very interesting. A lot of students find it interesting, believe it or not, because he sort of gets into this idea of how families came to be the way they are. That is sort of a patrilineal primacy, and that has not always been the case. And he argues against that particular model. And he's got his own particular view on it. And it's sort of given rise to a lot of other spin-off academic disciplines. So we will talk about that a bit later. I couldn't find any videos that were really useful for him. Some of them were very complicated and were too long. And I'm not under any illusion that if I post a 43-minute video to a link to a YouTube video, that we're going to get a whole lot of people watching. I mean, I think it's a little bit too much to expect, but I try to keep it, 8, 10, 12 minutes, something like that. I think they're nice. Those are sort of easy to follow. You can stop them if you need to. Most people can sit through 8 or 10 minutes. 43 minutes, that's a little bit much to ask. So I didn't find anything on that, but we will talk more about that. Again, the textbook for the class doesn't have specifically this material. There is a bit on Marx. There may be something on Ricardo, I don't recall offhand, but for that, a lot of what we're going to be talking about is not covered in the McConnell text. So I want to also remind everybody to keep participating in the discussions. You want to post at least by Thursday of every week to whatever the discussion topic is, and then make one additional post sometime some other day during the week to some other course participant. It could be even somebody who applied to your initial post. It's fine. It's not a problem to do that. And so this is also posted and available for you to look at. These PowerPoints I'll probably post toward the end of the week. I want to sort of make these sort of coincide a little bit with where we are in the class. So since I'm sort of creating some of these slides as we go here, I don't want to have these out of sync too much because I think it's easier for you to sort of follow along. And I know I'm throwing a bit of a wrench into it with Mark's here in week 6, but I want to make the PowerPoint sort of jive a little bit with the material itself. But so once I know how far we get today, I'll post those, and those will coincide a little bit with where we have one. Okay. And please make sure you mute yourself if you would. So, are there any questions for me about anything before we get started here and with today's class session? I've got the transcription on if that helps, and hopefully everybody can hear me. If not, as we get going, go ahead and hit the chat box and tell me, hey, we can't hear you. Yes, oops, wrong way. Everything's backwards. I gotta keep remembering everything's backwards in this room. So I want to pick up from where we left off last time. We were talking about the work of Adam Smith, and let me tighten this up a little bit here. And so, and again, I'll post this a bit later for your review. But I want to finish up talking about Smith. And by the way, if you have, once we get going here, and I do ask that everybody sort of mute yourself. But if you want to put something in the chat box, feel free to do that. It may be a couple minutes before I see it, but that's one good way to sort of communicate with me is to put something in the chat box. Also, make sure when you log in to put your name there so I know who you are. What happens is the attendance is reported. It basically is a download to an Excel file that I make. I simply download out of Zoom, and if it says something other than your name, I can't record your attendance, and we're supposed to, sort of a regulation for institutions that receive financial aid to record people's attendance. So that's the way that I do it in this real-time class. So make sure you do it. It looks like everyone's got their names in there, and that's good. Okay. All right. So let's pick up with Adam Smith last time. I think we ended up talking. We were talking, I think, around somewhere in this area here. We talked about Smith and free trade. We talked about him being a critique of what's called a mercantilist system. This term may not be familiar to everyone, and you may have heard it, you may have not heard it. I've heard it before, but what it is, it was a system of basically national power expressed through economics, not so much through military means, although there was a military motivation, a political motivation, and imperial motivation, if you like, for expansion. And you know, the age of exploration, which is one term for nations, particularly in Europe, sort of branching out across the world, also had its roots and its motivation. This idea of mercantilist system, national power expressed through economics. And that is, but also had another idea that was sort of a dark side of it, and among the many dark sides of imperialization, of empire building, and that was the idea of the view that one nation's gain was another nation's loss. And it actually translated down to the micro level as well. If I gain in some economic event, it means that you or our counterparty have lost. And so it's this idea of a what we call a zero-sum game in economics. And that is, it's like in sports, right? I know there are ties in football and hockey and whatnot. There didn't used to be ties in football, and there aren't in baseball, let's just say. Not that anyone watches baseball anymore, but it's so. One team must win, one team must lose. And that's sort of the idea that the mercantilist system has in mind. If one party gains, the other party necessarily must lose. And so as a result, national power is expressed in economics that way, which sort of leads to this whole idea of exploitation and whatnot. And he was sort of a critic of this in very many ways. And so one of the themes that I have been thinking about as I've been preparing this work on Smith was the idea that he was very popular in, I guess you could say, conservative economic and business circles in the 1980s in this country. There was sort of a resurgence of interest in Adam Smith, and sort of coincided with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, and sort of a pushing back of some of the more progressive / liberal economic policies of the day, political and economic policies of the day, Reagan made a lot of changes, and so Smith sort of came to light. He was a free market guy. And so I think that the reaction to that favoritism of Smith was that the political left in this country started to look at Smith as being sort of associated with, pro-capitalist, pro-exploitation, all these kinds of things. And I think that's a misreading. It's not a very reading of Smith, because I will tell you what I think about Smith, who did his major work in the 1770s, 1780s, was the fact that he was, I would consider him to be pretty radical for his time. He was saying, look, this system of land ownership, which was an inheritance from the feudal system, is something that is unproductive. And that means that, because think about where the wealth came from, and this is one of the things that one of the movements away from the feudal system to the industrial system was not only urbanization, along with urbanization came industrialization, but moving away from the land meant that land was no longer as important a factor of total productive wealth as were other factors like machinery and labor power and even intellectual capital and financial capital. It wasn't just agricultural produce anymore, but who owned the land? It was feudal land owners, for the most part, who were hereditary owners whose family had held that land for centuries. And as a result, all they did was simply collect rents, and they didn't really do anything productive but that. And so Smith was saying that's not a productive system. And so he was really one of the first to advocate what we call a progressive tax system. We talked a bit about this last time. I think that's sort of more or less where we ended up last time. So I'm going backwards a little bit in order to go forward. So when we talk about progressive taxes, we're saying that progressive taxes, and we talked about this a bit on our fiscal policy piece, was the ability to pay. It's based on what we call the ability to pay principle. And it's the idea that those who are most able to pay taxes are the ones who should pay the most in taxes. And our discussion in fiscal policy from last time in class in our Zoom session was about income tax. Well, there wasn't really an income tax in the time in which he was working, because it really wasn't, the system of accounting wasn't very elaborate, wasn't very formalized. But land, everyone knows where the land is because it's not moving around and it's easy to see, and whatnot. So taxation of land was really the issue. And who owned the land? Again, it was these feudal land owners, or the hereditary owners of these of this land. So he proposed taxing that, as opposed to taxing workers' wages. And so as a result, and it's the idea of progressive taxation. That is what we would consider to be a very liberal idea today. Also to consider the fact that he was really pushing back against the power of the state and saying, look, the laissez-faire economics, we talked a bit about this in our discussion, was the idea that people ought to be able to do what they want to do without government interference, and government, you should stay out of our lives. This idea of being able to trade freely, internationally as well as with each other, and to produce what we want to produce, to consume what we want to consume, to work at whatever occupation we want to work at. And government, you shouldn't tell us what to do. That was a pretty radical view for 18th century Britain, particularly given the fact that they had a very despotic king at the time, George III, whom the United States went up against. George III was very active in trying to promote the aristocracy, and really had some issues of his own, as a lot of us know. He had some real mental problems, and so somebody who was basically pushing the king was taking some chances. I also talked about the efficiency of markets, the idea that markets work very well, and they work when they are allowed to work well. This invisible hand, which I know we talked a bit about this last time, it's sort of this idea. I think in economics today, we probably would refer to that as what's called the multiplier. And that's the idea that as economic activity takes off, people produce output, people consume output, workers are paid wages, that then they channel into spending, which then translates to more production and more consumption, which translates to more wages and more spending, and government's getting its share as everyone's earning more and whatnot. All that is the idea of the rising tide lifting all boats. And that's what the invisible hand is about. So it sounds like a fairly mystical idea that I mentioned last time. It sounds like it's a little bit kind of goofy and sort of metaphysical, but in reality, we today can measure this activity. And so markets work efficiently when they're left to work efficiently, which is not to say that government should not have a role to play at all, because And one of the things that I think needs to be re-examined with Smith, or at least pushed back upon, is the criticism of Smith, is the idea that before he published The Wealth of Nations, he really sort of came to prominence in intellectual circles with a work called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which was really about the idea of how we treat the less fortunate in our society. And he talked about this idea of sympathy and having sympathy for those who are less fortunate for whatever reason, physical disability, or being orphaned, or living in poverty, or having ailments of various kinds. And so as a result, society should do its best to take care of the least, to sort of quote a biblical phrase there. And so, and I think that would not be inappropriate, because he did teach moral philosophy from that particular viewpoint, and a sort of theological viewpoint. So he was not he could not be associated with somebody who said, hey, if you're poor, it's your fault. That's not what he's saying. There were those who came after him that did have that sort of view, and there are people today, I know there are in the business world, who kind of think that if you're poor, if you're less fortunate, it's your own darn fault. He's saying that is not the case, and that sympathy ought to be there for those. And so as a result, this is something that's a little bit different, a little bit less well known about Adam Smith. When we think of him as an economist, and we think of him as a free market guy, kind of guy, and a capitalist, and let's build factories and all that kind of thing. That is true, but he's also saying it's an extension of our individual freedom, but our individual freedom should be curtailed by our need to take care of others. And so that's good. And so one other thing about Smith that I want to talk about is this idea of, he pushed back against politicians who wanted to constantly go to war. Now, this is an interesting idea, and it doesn't often come up with Smith. And I know that I'm sort of getting a little bit out of my lane here as an economist by talking about this, but he said that, look, from an economic standpoint, war is devastating. And I know that a lot of people, particularly in this country, don't have this idea. And I can tell you that growing up with parents who are the World War II generation, that they were of the view, and everyone else was around their age, that war was, quote unquote, good for an economy. And I think you'd have a different view entirely if you grew up in Germany or Japan or Korea, or places where there had been lots of war. There hasn't been a war in the United States since the 1860s. And so, and that was devastating economically, in addition to everything else the war does, which is self-explanatory. But he was saying, look, from an economic standpoint, war is devastating. It's very costly. A lot of people don't survive. It causes all kinds of dislocation, and yet politicians continually go to war. And by the way, Britain was almost continually at war throughout this period and throughout the next century, and up until the mid-20th century was more or less continually at war with somebody around the world. And whether it was the French or the Germans or the Russians or whomever, or South Africa or in India or wherever they were operating. And so he was very much a critic of his own government from that particular standpoint, and it was very expensive. And so he was somebody who was not particularly sympathetic to that. So the idea that we should associate him with sort of these ideas of state power as well as capitalist power, I think should be modified a bit in light of some of these theory of moral sentiments and some of the things he was talking about there. Okay. All right. So I know we talked about Smith mostly last time, but I wanted to sort of move on and talk about Ricardo. And Ricardo is an interesting character. And again, I'll be posting these slides for you a bit later, so you've got this. So Ricardo was not really a contemporary of Smith's. He was a little bit later. He didn't live a particularly long life. In fact, he retired at a fairly early age, in his early 40s, I think. He had been a stockbroker in London. His father had done the same thing. He basically took over the family business, so to speak, although he was sort of estranged from his family from a personal standpoint, because he ended up leaving Judaism and marrying a Christian, marrying a Protestant, and his family was not actually okay with that. So he was sort of living in two worlds in that regard. I'm sure it was a conflict for him, but nonetheless, this idea was taking over the family business. He became very wealthy in stockbrokering and sort of retired to go write economics. And his main work was published in the early 1800s called The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. This is really probably the first big and in-depth book about economics in terms of studying individual markets, in terms of demand and supply, and bringing both sides of markets together, in addition to talking about the idea of free trade. And I want to circle back to something I talked about with regard to trade earlier, and that was the idea that when economists use the word trade, they're almost always referring to international trade. Unless something is different unless they say something different, trade usually refers to trade across international boundaries. And Smith talked about it for sure, no question about it. And but Ricardo was really the one who sort of picked up the ball here and said, look, free trade is a good thing, because basically what it does is this. And we have since known this, that free trade has more, there are downsides to it, no question there are downsides to it, but there are the upsides outweigh the downsides, I think, as a general idea. And yet this was not common knowledge, because this idea of mercantilist thinking was still going on. The idea that if we engage in trade with somebody else, we've got to have somehow the upper hand, and that we don't want to send a lot of money overseas to get a lot of goods that we really don't need in the first place. And so as a result, we want to sort of control this this activity. And one of the ways that the British Parliament was controlling that activity was through something called the Corn Laws, which were on the books for many decades in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. They were finally repealed around the 1840s after Ricardo died. By the way, Ricardo was a member of Parliament, a member of the House of Commons, and stood in opposition to the Corn Laws. Now, what were the Corn Laws? They were basically protectionist legislation. And what that means is whenever a government imposes some sort of restriction on somebody else coming in and doing business, then it's called protectionism. And in this case, it's somebody who is trying to sell grain products. It wasn't just corn, in fact, it was mostly wheat, to be honest with you, from abroad, whether it was France or Belgium or the Netherlands or Germany, who wanted to sell their grain into Britain. There were trade barriers put up so that those goods could not be imported. Now, what did that have the effect of doing? Well, it had the effect of limiting supply of grain being produced, because the only consumption would have been that which was produced domestically. And by the way, we come back to who owns the land. Once again, it was the landowning aristocracy. And who dominated the House of Lords at the time? It was hereditary lords who had their heredity from these centuries-old landowning estates that produced the land. So as a result, almost the entirety of the House of Lords was opposed to repealing the Corn Laws because it benefited them, but it did not help the general population because it raised food prices, obviously. And so anything derived from grain, whether it's breads or cereals, or whether it's feed for animals, all of which went up in price simply because of the restriction in that. And yet, argued against it vehemently for years and years. In fact, it didn't get repealed until sometime fairly long after he had died, mostly when the industrial power rose up and said, look, you know, we're protecting these landowning, feudal landowners who don't do anything. And then you really get into something very interesting that sort of will take us into Marx, where he starts to talk about this conflict between the rise of the manufacturing class, who are new and they do not come from the landed aristocracy, and these feudal land barons and earls and dukes who have inherited their titles. And that came a bit later, and so it took quite a while for that to happen. But Ricardo argued for the benefit of repealing that and going to free trade. He also was to talk about something called comparative advantage. Comparative advantage, and if you take any subsequent economics classes, it's extremely likely you'll come across the term comparative advantage again. What it basically means is this: it means that nations should produce those things doing and avoiding those things which it is less well off at doing. And it doesn't matter if whatever it is that the nation is doing, that they're not the best at it. It's just that they should avoid what they're less good at and do what they're the best at, because and it really has this idea of focus and division of labor and specialization. And that if you're really good at producing something, or you have a natural advantage through natural resources or whatever, that's what you should commit yourself to doing. So if you're Italy or Spain, where there's lots of wine growing regions, they should probably focus on wine and those goods which are derived from that particular natural resources. Even if they're not the best in the world at producing it, those are some advantages which they've got. Avoid some other things which they're not as well up at doing, like maybe producing steel. Steel came a bit later, but or producing iron or ironworks or copper or things of that, things of a manufacturing sort of nature. And so the idea of doing what one does best and avoiding, and this is important too, avoiding what one does less well. And the idea of comparative advantage translates all the way down to the individual level. And I know that in a lot of econ textbooks, you'll see some interesting articles, about people who have decided to specialize in certain areas at very young ages because they want to sort of strike when the fire is hot. Whether it's somebody like LeBron James who skipped going to college, went straight to pro basketball. It made sense from an economic standpoint. And by the way, you can always go back to college, but you can't always, make tens of millions of dollars a year doing being a pro athlete. So he struck when the fire was hot. Or, actors and musicians and whatnot decided to give up something in order to do something else because they were the best at it. Bill Gates left Harvard in order to start a software company, which is an industry that really didn't exist in the current form that we know of it today. He did what he did and avoided that which he did less well. And so, not that he wasn't a good student at Harvard, I'm sure he was, but rather focus on what he did best. And that's what comparative advantage is all about. The idea that you do what you do. And by the way, this idea of comparative advantage even translates today. Probably one of the most liberal economists today is a guy named Paul Krugman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2008. We're talking about for his work on trade. And I know that international trade has gotten sort of a bad reputation over the last several decades because it does cause dislocations. No question, the United States has lost tens of thousands of manufacturing plants that have closed here and have gone to Mexico, China, all around the world, India, overseas, wherever. Those are dislocations, and those are not good. Same time, though, those nations that are developing, free trade helps them to develop their economies. And so as a result, in the very short run, yes, you can see where this mercantilist thinking comes from, the idea that if I lose, someone else gains. That's a very short-term thinking. Krugman is saying, look, the idea is that these nations can develop, even if all they've got to offer is their labor. They've got no natural speak out, but they do have labor power. And as a result, that will help them to develop their economies and to grow wealth in that regard there, even if that's the only thing that they have to offer. And I think probably there are very few economies that have not labor, but because there are natural resources and there are other, there are some natural, there are some nations that have natural sort of geographic locations that help trade. Egypt, for instance, lies strategically along waterways, which has helped its trade situation. Same with Spain and all. So, and then finally, the last bit that we want to talk about with regard to Ricardo is that he's one of the very first to talk about central banking and the idea of bank regulation, which was sort of ahead of its time in some respects. And in this country, it took about another 100 years. We really got our arms around what to do about central banking. I know Ricardo was an Englishman, so he wasn't specifically talking about the US, but what he was saying was, and today we take this for granted, the idea that we've got a central bank, which in this country is called the Federal Reserve, that sort of controls the money supply, controls the availability of credit, also is involved in bank regulation to maintain a stable order of financial flows, credit and deposits. But yet this was not widely accepted. Britain did have a central bank at the time, and yet it wasn't particularly as strong as what it later was. And he was arguing that bank regulation should be very stringent indeed. And I think that there's a lot to be said for this because, look, I was a banker for a lot of years, entered banking at a time in which everyone thought the banks, all bank regulation that we ever needed, we had enough of. And then if anything, we needed less regulation because it was tying the hands of bankers to do the things that they should do. The rest of the financial services area. And so there was a period of deregulation that was probably a contributor to the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And so I think that one of the things that episode, that long series of events beginning around 2007, 2008, 2009, told us was the idea that banks should be heavily regulated to the point where some had argued that banks should be regulated like public utilities, like P&M, and that they can still earn a profit, but they should be regulated very, very carefully as to what they do. I don't know that that's probably going to have any kind of a chance of flying here, particularly given the fact that a lot of people believe that whatever re-regulation that was imposed on banks after that period was insufficient in its own right. And they probably do have a bit of a point. Although if you ask bankers, and I happen to know many of them, having had spent so much time with so many of them, they would probably argue that the regulation was too stringent. But this is the thing you will hear everywhere in economics. And one of the things is this class is Introduction to Economics seeks to accomplish is to let everybody know that there is lots of controversy. People disagree on all sides of things. And so this was a fairly controversial idea at its time, that banks ought to be heavily regulated, because they were pretty, even in Britain at the time, there were a lot of out of the way areas that had very poorly regulated banks that weren't very well capitalized. And so would you want to put your money in a bank that didn't have very good regulation? Today, I think it would be unheard of for us to want to put our money in a bank and then even go to bed at night wondering whether or not our money is safe. I don't think any of us have gone to bed at night wondering if our money was safe. And I didn't worry about that during the financial crisis, because we had strong regulation and we knew that we would be in that regard. And that's really a centerpiece of financial regulation. And we will come back to a bit to talk about that after we get through some of these economic theorists. Okay, so that's Ricardo in a nutshell. Ricardo is an important economist, particularly from the standpoint of really sort of laying out and sketching for the world what these issues were in the time he was writing. And I think it's important when we talk about Smith and we talk about Ricardo, we talk about Malthus, that they were as much forward thinking as they were products of their day. But the idea that they were forward thinking is what made them new and different. And today they've gotten their place in the world of economics and politics and even philosophy to some extent, particularly when we talk about Marx. So Ricardo was definitely a product of this period in which the feudal order was beginning to die. This landed aristocracy, the power was beginning to wane. And by the way, in about 100 years later, the power of the House of the Lords was getting so weakened that the government in place at the time said, you know what we're going to do? We're just going to create something like 400 new lords, and that will dilute the power of the hereditary lords. And so as a result, landed aristocracy, this is the early 1900s, landed aristocracy, you will have no power whatsoever. And there was a threat by the government at the time. That was only about 100 years after Ricardo. And as a result, the House of Lords finally came to sort of realize its place, if you like. And that was the idea they were more of a rubber stamp, which is really what they mostly are today, even in Britain. Even though it's not dominated so much by hereditary people at all, it was mostly people who are given the title mostly for their lives, and then the title goes away with their death. Okay. All right. Now, Ricardo was a contemporary of the next guy we're going to talk about, Thomas Malthus. Malthus is an interesting character. And by the way, I posted a video out of YouTube last time, and I know that he's extremely controversial in many ways. And I know that one of the videos, I was a little bit leery about posting the video because I thought maybe people would construe it the wrong way. But when particularly we talk about what to do about population growth, he's controversial, and we'll get to that here in a second. But in the late 18th century, he published an essay called An Essay on the Principle of Population. So population studies, I think it's safe to say, which today is sort of morphed into what we call demographics, the study of population, the population dynamics, the characteristics of population. Really began, I think, with Malthus, who was really among the forerunners of this particular idea of studying population. And the idea was that population is a problem, particularly given the fact that productivity of output exceeds or cannot exceed the growth in the population. And what's very interesting about this is that if you consider the fact that, hopefully I'll bring some of the lights up here a little bit here, but the idea was that, and I'll just give you a quick graph here for what he was really getting at. Oops, turn the lights off there. Was that if we have a graph and we have on this axis here a percentage growth rate, okay? So that the vertical axis is the percentage growth rate, and we have a time scale on the horizontal axis, that what is happening is this, that you have that the growth in the productivity of food, that is food production is more of a linear function. That is, it grows at a fairly constant rate every year. Remember, what is a linear function? Remember what from algebra, what a linear function tells us, that it's a constant rate of growth, right? Constant rate of change, that is rise over run, right? Rise over run is what we're really talking about there. And so, yeah, I don't know if you guys can see it. I know on my screen it doesn't really come through very well. So food production is sort of a linear function The problem is that population growth is curvilinear. In fact, it's sort of hyperbolic. It sort of does that. And as a result, you've got what's called the Malthusian Crisis. That is the idea that population growth can exceed that of the food production. And I hope you guys can see this graph. It's hard for me to know because my screen doesn't have necessarily the same view that you do. But the idea is that there's a gap here. The population growth can outstrip food production. And as a result, what does that end up causing? It ends up causing starvation. And obviously not a good outcome. And so this was the fear that Malthus had, because he looked around at Britain and Western Europe at the time in particular and said, look, you know, we are getting to the point where population is growing so rapidly, and we've got this rising underclass of people who are poorly fed, poorly housed, and it's because of the fact we simply cannot produce enough food in order to support the population. And so as a result, whenever we think about Malthus and the sort of the adjective form of his name, Malthusian Crisis, we almost always think of overpopulation. And the idea was that populations will correct themselves, but only through some really, really undesirable outcomes like wars and famines or both. And that will bring it back into balance, but only because of the fact that you've got this continued conflict between the growth in the population and the growth in the food supply. And by the way, his work kind of took off in popularity, well, maybe not, popularity, I guess is the word, even after his death, because of the experience in the island of Ireland, where improvements in food production allowed the population to grow, but the population exploded once the potato was determined to be a viable crop. For those of you who know anything about Ireland, it's not a particularly great place to grow crops. It's very rocky, the soil is not particularly good. It's better for livestock than it is for growing crops and whatnot. And the potato did pretty well there, and so as a result, population exploded. But then when the potato crop got diseased, the population was still growing, but the food supply had shrunk, and so as a result, you had massive famine as a result. And this is why we have lots of Irish immigration. There are more Irish people living in the United States. In fact, there are more Irish people living on the East Coast of the United States today than what there are in the entire Republic of Ireland now. And so it's because of the fact that they had to simply move. As a result, famine set in because of this imbalance in between. So that was sort of a case in point, which didn't require Englishmen to look very far at discovering the fact that maybe he is on to something here. Today, when we think about Malthus, I think when he talks about crisis, there is a sort of a concept in economics known as crisis economics. And it's oftentimes sort of framed as a criticism of the official means by which we practice economics. And that is, capitalism tends to grow economies in which it's adopted, but then for the less well-off economies that simply don't have the means to produce output or can't trade with others, they get left behind. And so as a result, they have a crisis of famine or war. And the examples that we will look at today include sub-Saharan Africa, parts of that where there's lots of starvation going on. And as a result, this is sort of an example of where Malthusian economics has gone from there. And it's oftentimes dealing with where populations lie and the fact that and it's oftentimes a criticism of the fact that nations that are wealthier cannot support those which are less wealthy. But here's, I think, what Malthus would probably have said, which a lot of economists today would say, was that it's not so much the fact that there's too many people on Earth, it's that too many people are living in the wrong places. And that is the idea that parts of Africa are running out of water. And so as a result, water is obviously fundamental. It's the most fundamental of our good, maybe besides air, which fortunately there's no scarcity of, but there's a scarcity of water. And so as a result, people are living in the wrong places. To get them to move, though, is not a simple concept, and a lot of people resist the idea of people moving into other territories. That is an ancient idea of not liking people moving around into someone else's space. And so that creates a lot of difficulties. And we've got something similar that may be beginning to happen in the United States, and that is with the issue of water. We've got a lot of people living in places in which there isn't enough water. That's most of the Western US, particularly sort of south of Denver and sort of all the way to the Pacific Ocean. there just simply isn't enough water to sustain. And so we will have to see what happens in the future. It will be interesting to see, I think, whether we've got too many people living in areas where there's not enough water. Now, I come from the upper Midwest where there's plenty of water, and in fact, there's too much water. And so a lot of people have proposed the idea, and I've been one of them, that what if that water could be transported to the Southwest where it's needed? And I don't think the engineering is probably a bit complex, but not impossible. And I think we're probably going to see some solution there. In the less developed world, that might not be a solution. Okay, but we talk about Malthus. We're talking about the idea of population suffering because of population growth. Now, he was a clergyman, and so he sort of, and I think this is one of the things you have to understand about his suggestions, his recommendations, his solution of population growth. And he talked about abstinence and marrying later in life, and that would therefore yield fewer children. Obviously, you don't have to be married to have children, and that's not an issue, although in those days it was probably much less common than what it is today, certainly. But the idea of abstinence, and by the way, he was also against contraception and abortion, which kind of leaves, I mean, that kind of is a bit of a problem in the sense that you're leaving very much fewer options. I know one of the videos talks about this idea that maybe Malthus was sort of looking a bit askance at, but maybe saying that one solution that people have found was prostitution. I don't know. I'm sure that he was not advocating that publicly. If he was again, I mean, as a clergyman, I doubt that he could have made that stance. It's a controversial opinion, and I want to make clear. It's not my view in particular, but I do think that one of the things that's important for us to talk about is that some of these views that we get going here in economics and pretty much everywhere are controversial, and people do disagree, and it's for all of us to decide what's a good idea, what's a bad idea, and that's the way we sort these things out. So we talk about Malthusian economics, we're talking about this idea of excessive population in relation to the food supply. And as a result, he was a really important thinker from this particular standpoint. And today, where his work sort of stands is he sort of has lent himself to work, particularly in areas dealing with the environment, particularly with global climate change. There was a great book published by the New York Times reporter Thomas Friedman called Hot, Flat, and Crowded, which if you're interested in climate change, it's been out, it's not a new book, it's been out for several years. But he talked about this idea that the world is becoming more crowded and it's becoming flatter. And by flatter, he simply means that we're more connected and that we're all sort of linked to each other. And it's also becoming warmer because of global warming. And so we're seeing melting of polar ice, which we're seeing sea levels rise. And we're seeing all kinds of effects of global climate change. And I know that there is a view that climate change is some sort of hoax. And I don't know where that idea comes from, other than the fact, but Friedman addresses that in his book. It says that there are really three categories of people who deny climate change. One of those are people who simply, it's not in their interest to have to pay for the climate change. Big business in particular, who is arguing against the idea. But today, I don't think there's much doubt at all that the global climate is changing. Question about it. And I know that there are those who have a sort of snide response. Every time there's a snowstorm, they push back on the idea of global warming. And that's not at all, no one's saying that snow will continue to fall while the median temperature is rising pretty much across the world. So I think that's really something that we need to pay attention to. And it's this idea that population is probably in the wrong areas, and that's a challenge for us. By the way, I saw a study not too long ago of the fact that if we talk about the entire population on Earth and just how large the Earth is in relation to population, then we could give everybody on Earth an acre in Texas, just the state of Texas, and have land left to spare, lots of land left to spare. Now, obviously, it's not going to happen. You can't just give everyone 1 acre and say, here you go, you're all, I mean, it's not going to happen. But what I'm simply saying is that there's lots and lots of land. It's just that people tend to be concentrated. Urbanization is a product of industrialization, and as a result, people are in the wrong places in lots of cases. And so, as a result, people can sometimes move on their own, and sometimes they cannot move on their own. One of the things the pandemic, by the way, has pointed out is the fact that people living in very expensive cities are starting to move out of those expensive cities, particularly in America, but I think it's elsewhere as well. And we will see whether or not the move back to the country is going to to happen or not. That will be an interesting sort of development. Okay, so that's Malthus. Any questions about Thomas Malthus? I know that we had him scheduled up through last week, and so I wanted to sort of move on to what I wanted to get to this week, which was the study of Marx and his writing partner Engels. Okay, and if you do have questions, feel free. You can just unmute yourself and ask a question or put something in the chat. And if you don't want to shout out in front of the class, then feel free to hit me up later. That's particularly fine. So I had omitted this from the syllabus, and I don't know why, because I definitely planned on talking about Marx and where he fits in. Let me just, one thing about Karl Marx is this. I know that I think we studied this a little bit when I was in high school, but not very much. I think that Marx, a lot of times, is considered too hot to handle, particularly for high schools, because he's just so controversial, particularly this idea that workers would simply overthrow the factory owners and business owners and throw them out on the street and take over and usurp businesses. I think that has always in this country been a radical idea. But that was not really the central theme. And in fact, it has never really come to pass anywhere. And I know that the Russian people have got this mythology about overthrowing the Tsar. That was not an industrial society that was overthrown. Marx thought that the industrial society would be overthrown, and that was primarily a very feudal land-based society, not very industrial, not all that urban. Outside of Moscow and Leningrad, or St. Petersburg, was not all that urban, and so as a result, never really has come to pass. But that wasn't really the central idea of what Marx was talking about, even though he's associated with the creator of communism. So why do we study him? Well, I think it's important, particularly as an economics instructor, that we at least cover it, because I think there's probably nobody who has studied the more academic disciplines than Karl Marx. Mostly because he's got so much to say on so many topics. His work was so in-depth, and was really one of the creators of this whole sort of branch of academia known as social sciences, where he studied in political science, history, sociology, economics, philosophy, women's studies, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about Engels. And Engels sort of picked up this idea of male primacy after Marx died. Marx was working on that idea until he died. And Engels lived a little bit longer and sort of ran with that. But so many different academic disciplines in which his work comes up. And he's influenced so many governments around the world, some of which have tried to apply Marxian theories to become a Marxist sort of policy. So it's important that these two adjectives are different. Marxian usually refers to the theoretical ideas behind Marx's work. Marxist refers more to the political movements that have arisen from it, or at least have purported to arise from his work. Much of which has not been particularly successful, to be very honest with you. And I know there are those who would sort of say that colleges and universities are chock full of Marxists running around. And that is not the case at all, because Marxism, in many ways, as a political theory, has not really translated very well into the 20th century, much less the 21st century. But he had a lot to talk about, which was interesting. And by the way, we study him in economics because of the fact that he sort of fits into a special place here, particularly dealing with the idea of labor. Labor economics is, as I mentioned in the very early part of the class, a subfield within microeconomics, an important subfield, the idea of how we study labor markets and how we study the idea of wage determination and working conditions and workers' regulations. How do we protect workers and all that? A lot of this really started with Marx. Nobody really was talking very much about it, with the exception possibly of Smith. And he sort of picked up the ball from where Smith left off on this idea of how labor is to be treated. So his main work was something called Capital, which some people insist on the German terminology of Das Kapital, which was basically a very, very long 4-volume set of works, some of which were revised and edited by Friedrich Engels, who is his writing partner. We'll talk about Engels in a minute. Engels and Marx were sort of the odd couple in some ways. They both fled Germany, but Engels was pretty much established in English society. Marx and Engels couldn't be different from a financial perspective. Marx was an intellectual who didn't really find much work, mostly worked as an itinerant journalist, more of on an ad hoc basis, never really had a lot of money, was supported financially by Engels, who was a very prosperous individual. His father owned textile factories in Britain and Germany, was very wealthy. Ingalls was far from being the laboring intellectual in the library like Marx was. Ingalls was sort of a bon vivant, a party guy. He had lots of parties in his house, one that didn't really have to work, and but yet had a lot to say about those who did have to work, and was sort of shocked at the conditions upon which many people did have to work. So Marx's main work was Capital. Probably the other one that comes to mind is the Communist Manifesto, which is a very brief work, which really gets into this idea of what should be done against the system that he was so critical of, which was the emerging capitalist system. So we talk about Marx, and I feel it's almost a little embarrassing as a college professor to have Marx's ideas boiled down on one PowerPoint slide, because his work is so voluminous and he covered so many different topics. So just to point out the idea that this is woefully inadequate to summarize his work, but I do want to focus on what's important for how this sort of fits in. And that is the idea that Marx takes a long sweep of history and talks about this idea of class conflict. It actually goes back to feudal society, where you had feudal lords, and we've talked about this before in class. We had only 3 tiers of society: monarchy, very small; aristocracy, small but bigger than everyone else. And that is inherently a recipe for class conflict. And the idea that those who don't work should employ those who do have to work, and yet usurp their labor power has been something is a recurring theme, whether it's working for wages and producing output, or whether it's going to war. It's an exploitation of the masses by those who are in power, and that has been a recurring theme throughout society. This idea of class conflict, it's inherent. It's part of the baked-in system by which societies have organized themselves. And what's more is that Marx said that people were pretty much accepting of it, and not that the idea that they just had no choice but to go along with it, which they probably really didn't, but that they were accepting of it, and that they went along with it. It was part of the bargain, particularly in feudal society, where, okay, we'll do a little bit of work for you, lord, and we'll get a little bit of the share of our output. And as a result, we'll be taken care of, we'll get to live on our land, we get to raise our families, we'll get to do all these kinds of things, but you are in charge, you are the boss. And so we sort of get that. Well, that idea sort of carried over into industrial society, where there was a boss, and but was different than the feudal lord, which was a little bit different. So he says, look, it has nothing to do with heredity. It has to do with the idea of class conflict, which is inherent. That you've got bosses and non-bosses. And furthermore, when industrialization happened, and by the way, when we talked about the Industrial Revolution and what this was associated with demographically, and moving away from the land to the cities, to work in what were manufacturing operations, wholesaling, shipping, distribution, retailing, all that. You were moving away from the land. As a result, but you still had people who owned what were known as the factors of production. The factors of production, those means by which wealth is created: machinery, buildings, inventory, materials, all those kinds of things. And labor, which is not really owned, but is it? And Marx was saying that here's the problem, that at least in the feudal society, the worker was more or less connected to his or her labor. That is, you got some of the benefit of your own labor. You produced agricultural output. You get to have some of your own chickens and pigs and maybe a cow, and you would get some of the agricultural produce. And you can see what you produced, and you got some of the benefit of the produce, even though some of it was paid in the form of tax and rent to your feudal lord. Here, you just simply work for a fixed wage, and the value goes off to somewhere else, and it's never to be seen again. And that furthermore, this separation of the value of your labor, which by the way is sort of the topic of our discussion in Brightspace this week, is this idea of separation of the worker from the value of his or her labor. That is what Marx called the labor power is actually sucked up by the owners themselves. The idea is that there's a difference, and there's an inequality between the value of inputs and the value of outputs. And that is, you've got inputs, which are all these things which go into producing output: labor, materials, machinery, and then outputs are all the goods which are sold to buyers, right? That the output value far exceeds the input value, the difference between being obviously profit, and that profit goes away. And so when we talk about the labor theory of value or the theory of surplus value, it's basically the same thing in some ways. Is the idea that surplus value is the idea that labor is being undercompensated for its efforts because of the fact that they're producing more valuable output than what they're being compensated for in terms of wages being paid to them. Now, why this didn't translate very well into the current, I think a lot of economists would probably not buy this idea today, particularly as we've gotten more into the high-tech world where, and it is true that in a lot of organizations, the main cost of production is labor. In a lot of organizations, the main cost is labor. But as we get into things like biotech and software and engineering and even finance, it's other costs. And so you can't really say that the major input value is necessarily labor. And so as a result, yes, there's a difference between inputs and outputs. The difference in those values is profit, but it is all according to labor. And so this idea of the labor theory of value does not translate very well. I don't think most economists could make a living today arguing for the labor theory of value. But it was something he didn't foresee happening, frankly. And the value, the output that was being produced up until the time that he lived was of not particularly high value. It was mostly apparel products. By the way, that was the first industry that really became associated with industrialization was the textile industry. The textile industry is anything that has to do with producing cloth, whether it's clothing or shoes or draperies or coats and socks and all those kinds of things. All that is associated with that. And those are very basic goods, but they're kind of low, what we would call low value goods today. And that, yes, probably labor was an important part of that picture. But today you've got much, much more high value output where the inputs are much more valuable. And so the labor theory of value does not translate very well today. But this idea of are workers being paid a fair wage, that is a very recurring theme. In fact, labor economics today really does talk a lot about this. And that is labor power being compensated for its labor? Now, what's really a bit about this a couple times before in this class, and I certainly do in my other classes, is the idea that we're in a sort of unique period in our history in which we've got, sorry about that. My wife is supposed to know not to call me this during class, but we're sort of an interesting time in our history in which wages are going up. Even as the economy is slowing down, we're starting to see some deflation of things like commodity prices like oil and gold and silver and grains and all that. But wages have been going up for some time. And again, as I mentioned before, I don't think it's going to stay there very long. But this is an expression of labor power. Labor has got the upper hand in a lot of these particular situations. And so this idea of labor power can shift over time, right? And as we've talked about before, one of the areas in which labor really had power was after the bubonic plague. As grotesque as that is, so many workers were wiped out that those who remained actually had lots of bargaining power. And so the idea is that employers will pay more if they have to pay more, that they have to pass the costs along to buyers. If they're able to do so, they will do so. And so as a result, that's one explanation for why we've got some of the inflation at the moment, okay? So this is the idea of the theory of surplus value, that workers create more valuable output than what they're compensated for, that accrues to capitalists. And think about the very term capital itself and what, and by the way, in economics, the word capital itself is probably the most ill-defined term, mostly because it's got so many different definitions depending upon what we're talking about. I mean, it could be if you have X dollars in your retirement savings, that's capital, or in your bank account, that's capital, or you have a home, and that's my capital, or if you're a business, it's very formally defined as the value of assets minus liabilities. That's capital. Well, I think one thing that we can say, one catch-all definition for capital that fits all descriptions is anything which we built upon to produce future value. It's anything which is earned and accumulated that can create future value. And it's usually as a result of past events, through savings or accumulation or whatever. And the term accumulation sounds better in German actually than it does in English. It's the idea that capital will build up and build up and build up. And if the capital is flowing to the owners, that means that capital is continue to get wealthier and wealthier and wealthier while the workers just paid enough of a wage. And by the way, there's one, I think it's the second video that I think is really good, talks about this idea. And as output becomes cheaper because we're producing so much of it, that it doesn't cost that much to produce output, and competition forces prices down, that firms will try to lower wages as a result of that. And we have seen that happen. Not that firms are lowering wages, but wages have not caught up with productivity. And that's really one of the themes of this week's discussion in Brightspace. We have seen wages not really catch up with the value of output. Think about this. Think about the stock market, which has grown dramatically, almost exponentially in the last 40 years or so in value, but workers' wages have not. Now, is that a Marxist critique of the capitalist system? I don't know, maybe it is. Maybe it is. But one of the things that Marx's idea is, this is why we still study Marx, is this idea of where labor is and is labor being compensated for its efforts. It's something to think about. Yes, it's controversial. Yes, it riles people up. People have been rounded up by the cops over years for these sort of subversive views. But you get the idea. Marx is that way, and so we talk about it here because it does have resonance, and we continue to talk about this idea of labor. And by the way, one of the things in labor economics, which is a big issue right now, and I can even link to an interesting article by the aforementioned Paul Krugman, was this idea of CEO compensation, and the fact that the top officers of corporations are making many times more than what the average worker is, and as a result, are they being overcompensated? And I just had a conversation with somebody a couple of days ago about the former CEO of Boeing, who basically resigned in the face of all this criticism of had crashed on the new 737, which had crashed 2 or 3 times, I forget exactly. And he knew apparently, or at least is being accused of having known, that this was a defective product. And families of the deceased, as well as shareholders, and they want to get back some of the $60 million he was paid on his way out the door. That wasn't his salary, that was just his going away gift. And $60 million, really? That's, I think you can easily criticize that as being an unfair compensation of those who control the factors of production, as opposed to those who control the means of subsistence. Okay, some other things I think are really interesting here is I want to talk about something that Marx talked about called the Cash Nexus. The Cash Nexus is interesting. It was sort of picked up a bit later by the work of John Maynard Keynes, whom we will talk about next week. And that is the idea that what capitalism has done is transform society from a sort of a society of people working together more or less in harmony, and that is our connection to one another is bound together by money and financial ties, and that I don't know anybody except for the fact that they are the person that cuts my hair. My doctor, I really don't know. My doctor is just somebody I pay to write me a prescription, or an antibiotic or whatever. I really don't know people. The people I work with, I really don't know that well. My boss doesn't want to know me. He doesn't want to go out after work with us. He's simply our employer and all that. And so that's the idea that we're bound together. The nexus means connection. That's the connection that society has, in the capitalist society has grown into. And it's the obsession with wealth accumulation. And the idea that people are inordinately sort of bound together based upon that association. And it's also known as what's called materialism, which is obviously a term which I think most of us have heard today. That's the obsession primarily with objects and things of value in particular, and the idea that we are fixated on it. And as the economy grows, as our means of production allow us to produce more and more output, we have more and more of this. And the question is, are we obsessed with these things? Are these the right things to be obsessed with or not? So even though Marxism with labor theory of value does not translate very well, and definitely this idea of class overthrow does not translate very well to today's world, there are some interesting things. And I think that Marx's work is always, if not anything but interesting. He's just an interesting read. And some of the things he talks about are really interesting and relevant even to today. The idea, what is the relationship between employer and employee? And by the way, one of the things that I think is very interesting when we talk about CEO compensation is there's been a sort of an effort in the financial world to sort of push back against some of these CEOs who are raking in tens of millions of dollars a year, sometimes for doing fairly mediocre work, by the way, in all honesty. And the idea, and some of the people pushing back are those who are people who are maybe beneficiaries of the same system. A guy named Carl Icahn, who is a prominent fixture in the financial world, has always pushed back against executive compensation. Why should these people who are basically employees of the company get so much money when in fact they're not, they're doing average work, and as a result, they should pay the company back because we're the owners. And he's an investor in a lot of these firms, and he says we're being ripped off by the people who run the company. And by the way, this idea, Marx also talked about this idea that it's not just capitalists against workers, it's also capitalists against capitalists. And that you can go up and down the scale here of prosperity because of the fact that this system of the Cash Nexus forces continual competition and all that. So interesting ideas from that standpoint. And I think if you are interested in Marx, there's plenty of to go around. And I do feel like it's woefully inadequate for me to post one PowerPoint slide on Marx because his work is so voluminous. But it is interesting to sort of talk about, even though as an economist today, he probably would not be employable. And I know that for those of us who made good livings in financial markets, he was sort of the the devil. Never considered to be very popular among business circles, to say the least. Okay, questions about Marx? I want to finish up. We've got just a little bit of time here, and unfortunately, I do have the time. I think to talk about Engels. Now, we talk about Marx. We talk about sort of the junior partner, I think, in this relationship, a guy named Friedrich Engels. Engels, again, is an interesting character, I think, in some ways, and he sort of does not get the credit. Certainly does not, it does not have the name recognition that Marx does, but yet he was working side by side with Marx for many years. They published a newspaper together, and he was a co-author of what's called the Communist Manifesto. And then the one that I think is the most interesting and has particular relevance here is this idea that this work on the origin of the family, which again is controversial. There's no question about it. But I'll let you decide, is there any part of this that you like? Is there any part of this that you hate? And one of the things that's interesting, and I think it's the difference between where we leave high school and we get into college, is the idea that we throw things out that we're saying, we're not saying this is necessarily the truth, we're saying this is someone's idea. And we'll let you decide what's good from it, what's bad from it. There are occasionally ideas which are considered so radical at the time, nobody buys them until they're revisited much later, and people say, wow, that person was 50 years ahead of his or her time, right? So sometimes these ideas take a while to germinate because they're so unusual, they take a long time to get going, right? I mean, the idea that the Earth revolved around the sun and not the other way around was so radical that it couldn't be taught, and it was quite a while before that became accepted. So we just simply throw these ideas out. You can do with what you like, but they do have formation in terms of where policy has come from, and policy affects all of us. And so there have been countries in the world that have adopted Marxian policies, particularly with regard to redistribution of land and resources and all of that, and with varying degrees of success. So what about Engels? Well, Engels, again, as I mentioned, was of a different background financially than Marx, but yet was very much on the same page in terms of his views about where labor fit into the picture, and was very much in accord with the idea that labor should eventually basically just seize the means of production and make things more even for everyone else. That is the heart of what communism is about. That would have argued against his own financial interest. Whether he knows that or not, I don't know, but that was the issue. But one of the things I want to talk about with Engels, which I've always thought for a very long time was the most interesting part, was this essay that he wrote on the origins of the family, where he goes back way, way, way back. And he actually references the work of an American anthropologist named Lewis Morgan, who studied the Iroquois Native Americans in this country, who had sort of what was known as a matrilineal prophecy. That is, the women were basically the heads of families and made the important decisions, particularly regarding families and household formation and things like that. It was the primacy of women. And he goes back further in time and says that was the case prior to even the advent of private property, which private property far predates industrial society. And so as a result, as anthropologists, he is saying that that women had a play which was much, much more prominent than what were men. And even in the animal kingdom, there are many species in which women are basically the primary, like that's not really a word, they have primacy in terms of their roles to play. It's a family role issue. This idea of joint tenements is where it was women basically lived together in family units where it was more than one woman, and all the children were considered to be all of their children together. They would do their thing. They would go hunt. They would go hunt, fish, ship, go to war and do all these kinds of things, while the women would be responsible for maintaining the family home. And so as a result, that was the primary society the organizing factor of society throughout most of humanity from the Stone Age until the advent of private property. But when private property began to become a thing, wealth accumulation, this began to break down. In particular, the idea that men began to assert themselves, particularly in the sense of owning property, and wanted to be able to pass it down to their heirs. And one of the ways that they did it was they enforced upon women a system in which women were expected to be monogamous, while men not so much. And so as a result, the forcing of monogamy on women meant that the ancestral line could be assured, that men's offspring could be guaranteed to be their offspring as a result of this enforcement of monogamy on women. And so this idea that the male prerogative took hold once private property began to be enforced. And the idea was that men were asserting this so that they could pass down property to their heirs as a result of that. And that social and legal customs adapted to this very thing. And so as a result, the patrilineal line became prominent throughout a lot of society, really around the world, but only with the advent of private property. Now, I don't know what you think about this idea, but I think it's interesting. And I'm not an anthropologist, I'm an economist. So I don't have this view, maybe the bigger picture view of how far back this goes of matrilineal primacy. But it's interesting that Morgan talked about this, and this was in the 1800s. We talked about in fact, he was so close to the Iroquois, I think they made him sort of an honorary member, that he studied their system. And it was in practice even up until that time, where women were the big deciders. There was a chief who was a man, but his role was primarily that of commanding their sort of military forces and whatnot. Instead, the main economic and sort of social force were women who headed up households, and as a result, matrilineal primacy was prominent in that society and had been, and it was a feature that had been on for many, many centuries, because the Iroquois were left undisturbed, as were many of the Native Americans in the Western world for many, many, many centuries, many thousands of years for that matter. And so as a result, we saw that system operating. It was a sort of a case study for Morgan's work, which then led to Marx becoming interested in this. Marx had started this work, Friedrich Engels picked it up. And I think it's really what it's given rise to is an entire body of work and study of where women should fit into society now. And in the very term history itself has been criticized, his story. And that as a result, a sort of a pushback of herstory has come along. And in fact, if you were studying history today, you probably would have better prospects studying things like gender relations and whatnot, because women have not really been written into history to the degree to which they probably should have. It's not that they've been written out, but they haven't been written in. I think that's a lot of what history is seeking to do in this particular case. And in terms of economics, which is really our focus here, it relates to the idea of private property as being central to this, as being the criticism of how this breakdown happens and the shift, and where society has adapted to that. And private property was considered to be difficult. And as we know, Marx and Engels both thought that private properties was a problematic concept in the sense that it meant time, but you don't have yours. And so it becomes more of a zero-sum game. My game is your loss and whatnot. So anyway, this has given rise to lots of other areas within the social sciences, in academia, women's studies, gender studies in general, all kinds of areas of philosophy and social studies in general. So are there questions about Engels? And I've only got about a minute left. in class, and I'm fortunate, I think, that we got through this. And so when we come back next week, we're going to talk about, we're going to take a shift. All these people we've talked about before, we're going to sort of put in one category called the classical thinkers. And we're going to, and we're going to sort of leave them all together. Even Marx fits into the same category as Smith and Ricardo. He doesn't look like he fits, but he does. And we'll talk about why, particularly as we get to the Great Depression, which afflicted the world beginning in the 1930s. And we're going to talk about that and how economics was sort of turned on its head. And that is an interesting discussion. And we will get to that next time. So other questions for me before we wrap this up today? All right, well, thanks for attending, everybody. And I'll see you in the discussions throughout the rest of the week. And have a great rest of your week, okay?